Baker Mayfield is kind of like the NFL version of Bitcoin. One moment you look up and his value is astronomically high. He is looked at as one of the new faces of the league. He is the guy that Tom Brady hands his rings to, metaphorically passing the torch. And he is seen as the next big thing, the next dominant force, the next Brett Favre, and then the next, his stock has plummeted to a point to where people legitimately ask me if the Browns should trade Baker Mayfield to get a shot at Joe Burrow. Now, this is no surprise to anybody who has followed Baker Mayfield for any amount of time. Baker Mayfield is polarizing. He's been so since his junior year at Oklahoma. Now, why is this? Well, this is something that I like to call the Tebow effect. See, when a quarterback is successful and popular in college football, but is also not considered a prototypical NFL quarterback, they are candidates for the Tebow effect. See, because the quarterbacks, again, were popular and were successful, but not a prototypical NFL quarterback, during the draft process, analysts and fans alike will dig in, arguing about why or why not said player can be successful in the NFL. This leads to massive polarization between both sides, which creates a group of people on one side who need to see this player be a success no matter what, and another group on the other side that need to see this player be a failure no matter what. See, while other players' flaws and missteps will go unnoticed and unspoken of, a player who is under the Tebow effect will be under a massive microscope. It's why Lamar Jackson can have one of the best seasons of all time and be a catalyst to a paradigm shift one week, and then have a bad game the next week and have all of his success in everything that he has accomplished thrown off the table and questioned, while Patrick Mahomes can go from 50 touchdowns to 26 and nobody cares. See, nobody invested a ton of time and a ton of their reputation arguing about Patrick Mahomes not being able to be successful in the NFL. Sure, there are people who thought he wouldn't be good, and sure, there are people who thought he'd be good, but since Patrick Mahomes really wasn't that good in college and really didn't have a ton of people have a lot of opinions about him in college, nobody was really that dug in. So it allowed people to appreciate what Patrick Mahomes became, while Lamar Jackson has polarized people because of his style of play since he walked onto a college campus. Now, let me make one thing clear. The Tim Tebow effect is one of the worst things about football in the modern era, if you ask me. It's everything wrong with how we talk about sports, and specifically quarterbacks, wrapped up into a little ball and cranked to 11. I absolutely hate the Tim Tebow effect. And just like Patrick Mahomes' greatness shouldn't be questioned because he failed to repeat one of the greatest passing seasons in NFL history, Lamar Jackson's greatness shouldn't be questioned because he had one bad game. But since Lamar Jackson was popular in college and more people invested their personal integrity into whether he'd be a good quarterback, Patrick Mahomes is free of that kind of energy. He doesn't have to prove or disprove certain narratives that people are dug in on. Now, let's go back to Baker Mayfield, who is interesting because despite him breaking the rookie touchdown record in 14 starts in 2018, which is impressive, his stock has dropped below Sam Darnold, who has not accomplished anything that you would call statistically impressive in 2 years in the NFL. But since Sam is seen as a prototypical NFL QB, less people spent time taking hard stances on whether he could play quarterback in the NFL. See, nobody is invested in his failure. Nobody has this narrative that they have to prove right or wrong about Sam Darnold. So he gets to develop without being under that same microscope that Baker Mayfield is. See, instead of having people wait and see what Baker Mayfield develops into and evaluating that as we go along, Baker came into the NFL with people convinced of two different narratives. One narrative that he was the second coming of Brett Favre and that he was going to set the NFL on fire, or the other narrative that Baker Mayfield was the twin of Johnny Manziel. So instead of evaluating what they see and talking about that, people on both sides were determined to prove their narratives correct. So when he was successful, people ran with it and blew it out of proportion. And when he failed, people ran with it and blew it out of proportion, which has left us with a super super unclear picture being painted about Baker Mayfield's future after 2 years. So let's actually try to break down the future of Baker Mayfield in a way that's not hyperbolic or hypercritical to get a clearer picture of what the future actually holds for him. The interceptions and inconsistency is one of the biggest things that I worry about when it comes to Baker Mayfield's 2019 season. Baker threw 21 interceptions this season. And while some may argue a lot of those interceptions weren't his fault, you can also say a lot of the interceptions he didn't have were dropped by defenders during the season. So no matter how you want to slice this up, Baker's 21 interceptions and 59% completion percentage are points of major concern, mainly because Baker's big selling point in college and in his second half of 2018 was his accuracy, his ability to take risk while not turning the ball over. And the fact that he has been so bad in those two specific areas is very concerning, given those are his strengths. It would be like Lamar Jackson not being able to run the ball anymore. It would be a huge hit to his game. Now, given the bad situation it appears that the team was in 2019, there is hope that that had a major impact on shaping the season and how that went. But the next thing that needs to be addressed about Baker Mayfield is the inconsistency. Baker this season was remarkably inconsistent. And the encouraging and frightening part is that the inconsistency came regardless of level of competition he faced. Baker, into back-to-back games against two of the NFL's toughest defenses in Buffalo and Pittsburgh, got 2 wins, threw for 4 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 431 yards on 61% completion, and a 98 passer rating. But then Baker Mayfield in 2 games against the Bengals, one of the worst pass defenses in the NFL. And well, he had 1 win, 1 loss, 3 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, 471 yards, but on 44% completion with a 59 passer rating. And this kind of inconsistency that is independent from the competition that he is playing makes me believe that Baker's issues this season were more than just bad scheme and an incompetent coach. I think a lot of Baker Mayfield's struggles in 2019 were internal. If you look at Baker Mayfield's 2019 offseason, it was busy, which is fine. A lot of players can have busy off seasons and it doesn't have an effect on their play. And I'm not here to suggest that his progressive commercials were what slowed him down. See, honestly, these kind of factors get overblown all the time by finger-waggy national media types who chastise players for craving the same exact attention that they themselves are trying to obtain. No, I'm not here for that. Peyton Manning found a time to do 1 million commercials for 1 million different companies and host SNL and still was able to play football. The commercials don't matter, but they are a symptom of a bigger change that affected Baker Mayfield. See, after the 2018 season, Baker's life changed in a very different way. Of course, he got married, but more importantly, he went from popular college football player to national celebrity. And more importantly, he was no longer an underdog. In no way can you justifiably frame Baker Mayfield in any real light as an underdog anymore. And see, that motivational story that Baker Mayfield had told himself to keep his bitter fuels burning was no longer true. See, the me against the world mentality when you're living in a dorm room and eating off a meal plan with nothing else to focus on and proving the doubters wrong is a much easier thing to buy into in that circumstance. But when you're outside of that bubble, that story just has a hard time ringing true. Especially when you're the first overall pick, living in a mansion, married and happy. When you're recognized as the next big thing, you're worshipped by an entire city. The NFL is desperate for you to become the face of its league. See, when all those things combine, it's hard to carry that kind of bitter, prove the doubters wrong mentality the same way that he did in college. And I'm not trying to psychoanalyze Baker Mayfield, but from the outside looking in, it does seem that Baker Mayfield is very superstitious and reliant on things like that to help him hit his next year. But the issue is that I think he's actually happy with life, which is great. Honestly, screw football. That's kind of the goal in life, is to be happy. But if you're Baker Mayfield, you have to find a new way, a new, more sustainable, mentally healthy way to motivate yourself into that extra gear that isn't reliant on bitterness. See, while others are going to use his media rhetoric, his talking points about his maturity, I could care less about what he says to the media and how he says it. The way Baker Mayfield needs to mature is not by giving better press conference answers. The way he needs to mature is the same way that a lot of people in his age group, including myself, need to mature, and that is by finding more sustainable motivation than bitterness. Some people find that motivation when they have a child, others have a milestone in life or professionally they want to reach, or people who have supported them that they want to prove right. Either way, I think Baker Mayfield has to find something other than bitterness to motivate him, because the truth is that narrative isn't true. He is no longer an underdog in the NFL. He was the #1 overall pick. He is the guy that the NFL desperately wants to be successful so they could plaster his face everywhere. He is remotely, in no way, no matter how much hate is thrown in his direction, is an underdog, because the establishment wants Baker Mayfield to be successful. Now, we've talked a lot about things that I'm worried about with Baker Mayfield, but let's talk about some reminders on why Baker Mayfield is worthy of having this kind of a video come out about him. And that is because the tool set that he possesses and has demonstrated that he has in the NFL is intoxicating. When Baker Mayfield is on, it is a sight to behold. He can be quick and efficient. His accuracy to make tight window throws on the run is just magnificent. He's mobile enough to elude most pass rushers, and he has the arm strength to give you a chance on a Hail Mary from his own 40 when he is playing well. He is exactly what any team needs or wants their quarterback to be. When you watch Baker Mayfield at his best in the NFL, it's not a mystery to discover why he went #1 overall, because honestly, he's not lacking in any tool or ability. But since he's not 2 inches taller, there are a lot of people who just don't see him like that. They ignore the fact that he has the same, if not better, physical tool set of a Sam Darnold, or to a lesser extent Josh Allen, and they don't allow him the same leniency that they offer those players. But that doesn't mean the same logic shouldn't be used for Baker Mayfield. And while that doesn't mean that we should just ignore the bad numbers this season or the disappointing win-loss record, it also means that we should take this season with a grain of salt. When I talked to JT O'Sullivan, a former NFL QB, and reviewed all of Baker Mayfield's interceptions at midseason, his impression wasn't of a quarterback who was struggling to read the field and make the right read, or one that was overwhelmed with the complexity and the speed of the game. It was that Baker Mayfield was not put in great situations to make good decisions, and a lot of the times it's because of the offensive scheme and offensive line. If Baker Mayfield's problems were more of the latter, I'd be hitting the eject button, I'd be hitting the panic button, and I'd be telling everybody to run, because those are tall tale signs that a quarterback cannot play consistently well in the NFL. But that isn't the case. Honestly, a lot of data suggests that if you put Baker Mayfield in just a slightly better position, he'd be very good. One of the least talked about things, which is interesting because it was one of the most talked about things in the offseason, was the big personalities, specifically in the Cleveland Browns locker room. Baker Mayfield, Odell, Jarvis Landry, all these big personalities. How would they get along? How would this not result in a ton of locker room drama? And while a lot of paranoia was spread about those personalities becoming a problem for the Browns this season, and from the outside looking in, you could see the dysfunction in the building around Cleveland, and you can try to blame the locker room. But those close to the situation, like most Browns fans are, understand that the locker room really wasn't the source of the issues this year. Honestly, the locker room was one of the few positives of this entire season, because the big personalities in the locker room were never close to being the actual problem in Cleveland. No, the big personalities that hurt the Browns this season were in management. You had this love triangle between Jimmy Haslam, Paul DePodesta, and John Dorsey that ended in disaster. You had Freddie Kitchens and Todd Monken basically ignoring each other, which is interesting because one ran the offense and the other called plays for that offense. So that doesn't sound like a good dynamic to have. Those are the real personality problems that the Browns had last season. And I think it says a lot about the amount of respect Baker Mayfield's teammates have for him, that he played so inconsistently, that he threw so many interceptions, but yet never lost his teammates. Nothing about the locker room was leaked this season. Nothing negative from a Browns player in the locker room was leaked. Odell didn't go with Josina Anderson on ESPN with Lil Wayne and complain about his quarterback like he did about Eli Manning. Honestly, it seemed like everybody got along and worked well with each other inside the locker room. It was the organization that surrounded the locker room that was a complete mess. And honestly, it took till week 10 after the Denver game where Baker Mayfield publicly announced that he was going to take more leadership over the offense for some of the procedural penalties, for those procedural and pre-snap penalties to drastically cut down. See, Baker Mayfield was a part of the locker room leadership. And from all accounts, the locker room was actually fine. It was the organization that was dysfunctional. So the fact that Baker wasn't a target of an Odell or Jarvis rant, or that nobody leaked about the quarterback not being as good as everybody thinks, or that, those kind of dysfunctional tidbits were happening throughout the season, given the massive disappointment that 2019 was, honestly says a lot about what the players in that locker room think about Baker Mayfield. See, when everybody is playing well, when the team is winning a ton of games, it's easy for everybody to look like a great leader. But when you stink and you're a failure and an embarrassing failure, and people still aren't pointing fingers at you and blaming you for the problem, honestly, that is a very good sign of good leadership. And I think that is a huge positive sign for Baker Mayfield. So what is the future outlook for Baker Mayfield? Now, barring Baker drinking whatever Ryan Tannehill had this season, I don't think Baker's going to come out in year 3 and instantly become 1995 Brett Favre Jr. But I also think he will have a much, much better season than he had last year and get back on the right track. He won't be in the MVP conversation. He's definitely not going to win the MVP, but he will be in the Pro Bowl conversation, and some may even vote for him as comeback player of the year, some kind of a meme. I think there is a lot to like about Baker Mayfield's upside that gets missed between the massive polarization on both sides of the Baker Mayfield ideology. The bottom line is that the skills and ability are all there. He has demonstrated an ability to use those skills and ability in the NFL. And I think more than anything, Baker Mayfield just needs an offseason to mentally put things together. But that's just my opinion. That's just my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Let me know what you think Baker Mayfield's future is. Do you think he's a boom? Do you think he's a bust? Do you think he's something in between? Let me know down in the comment section down below. Thank you guys for watching. And if you have a buck or two to spare, please consider joining the Patreon. $1 a month really helps keep the lights on in the studio. But nonetheless, have a great day. Have a good night.